Hello, my name is Deborah Park. I'm going to present Lament songs as communal liturgical voice for suffering, a contextual Korean exploration of Han in music of Park. Psalms of Lament are a pain, mournful expression of suffering and loss in the absence of God's presence. They are poems of complaint, helping the lamenting one to engage suffering and resist it, and thus find resources for resilience. Ultimately, lament can be express deep trust in God and affirmation in the face of despair that goodness goes still deeper and that God's loving embrace is steadfast and true even in the most difficult of circumstances. As such, the Psalms function as expression of faith in the life of the faith community. In an extreme situation, when one is overwhelmed by suffering, one can be rendered speechless, incapable of any forms of communication. In light of this, Dorothy Soler describes three phases of suffering: muteness, lament, and transformation. Muteness happens in an extreme form of suffering when one is overwhelmed and cannot communicate at all. This phase of lament occurs when the sufferer articulates suffering in mourning psalmic language that searches for help and liberation. Despair amidst extreme pain can be endured when the pain can be expressed. For Soler, lament enables a transition from isolated pain through communication to transformation. To resist suffering's power, to empower dignity, and to help us move through the suffering requires us to seek the language of lament. The expressive gesture of lament begins a process of recovering one's voice, gaining strength to speak and the reality of the situation, and to harness appropriate individual and communal power for use in fostering the well-being of all God's creation. In light of Psalms of Lament and the need for communal voice in suffering, Han, in the theological context, can be used to help understand the current condition of our world. It describes human suffering with reference to God and to human alienation from God, creation, and each other in sin. Han is an important phenomenon rooted in Korean culture and expressed in lament. It is a deep-seated sense of grief and mourning over being wronged by powerful agents of injustice, a deep sense of grief and cry of lament. Han is source for Korean songs, poems, and novels about the Korean people oppressed by injustice and afflicted by the loss of loved ones or the suffering of unusual circumstances. Han is expression of a profound sadness in response to a tragic life. Hearing such music, one feels a tragic beauty touching the heart. The lament that expressed Han honors the voice of protest and in the process building community through singing together in partnership. This presentation will restrict itself to focusing on Han as a way of reimagining lament in congregational worship music without fully engaging its political or theological dimensions. Specifically, it will examine the power of lament to express Han and suffering and the emerging futures of the world Christianity in post-COVID-19 time. It will develop a contextual aesthetic approach that highlights Korean musical forms which communicate this experience of Han. The hope is to provide content of practical value by showing that Korean traditional musical forms can be employed in worship to express Han through Psalms of Lament, providing support for incorporating Korean local cultural and spiritual heritages. The significant role of Psalm of Lament as a response to suffering emerges in 4 ways. First, these psalms are vehicles for expressing and communicating sorrow, anger, and human struggles. Second, psalms of lament can provide pathways out of the experience of muteness, of being overwhelmed and silenced by suffering, with the accompanying resentment that results. Third, they can build communal motivation and towards shared protest, becoming a resource of solidarity in giving voice to pain and struggle in the world. Finally, Psalms of Lament can bring cathartic emotional release in the context of faith, a prayer that grows from a profound yearning and deep desire for a healing relationship with God. The Psalms of Lament are a largest class of Psalms. More than a third of Psalter consists of lament psalms. Psalm 42 are individual laments, and another 16 are corporate laments. They are poetic hymns sung to God to express sorrow, human struggles, and suffering experienced by people of Israel when God's face was hidden. They deal with issues that are central to the life of faith for individual and whole community. Vatke concurs with RWL Mobile's statements that the power of lament lies at the heart of Israel's prayer, meaning that the problem of grief is not insignificant or unusual, but rather at the center of faith. Moreover, they show that experiencing pain and embarrassment in the life of faith is not a sign of lack of faith, but is inherent in the essence of faith. A psalm of lament, at its most basic, is an address to God in the form of complaint that is also request and an expression of trust. Brueggemann helpfully outlines the forms of the psalm in the theme of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. He asserts that human life is not just a statement of place where we find ourselves. It is also a movement from one situation to another. When we are surprised to be in a new situation we don't expect and feel resistance to a new place, desperately longing for an old situation. Disorientation is represented by the Psalms of Lament and complaint that are painful, agonizing, and harsh expressions of the movement of chaos and displacement, suffering, and death. This season of disorientation reveals robust resistance where the sufferer earnestly petitions God. Westermann has shown that the complaint song expressed the basic moves of faith in God, ranging from deep alienation to profound trust, confidence, and gratitude as plea and praise. There are 5 elements in plea: address, an introductory cry, complaint that describe how desperate the situation is, petition that earnestly appeals to God for justice and mercy, with the suggestion that unjust situation has risen because of Yahweh's lack of attention, motivation that provides reason for God to act. Imprecation that utters resentment that will not be satisfied until God retaliates against the wrongdoers. In complaint psalms, the petitioner lays the human situation of disorientation at the door of Yahweh. Plea is transformed into praise when one is convinced that the grievance is heard by Yahweh, who will free us. The Psalms of Lament serve to affirm that it is possible for help to come out of life, darkness, and broken relationships. Thus, the power of lamenting voice, both individual and communal, attests to our humanity in the face of darkness as it searches for new life. It testifies to a resilience that refuses to acquiesce to suffering that despair as final word. In doing so, it begins to open up possibilities beyond suffering as the defining totality of life, affirming hope, and even issuing praise. Han is a multi-dimensional phenomenon in Korea. It is deep sensibility related to suffering of the people, which is expressed in lamentation, operating on many levels, from social to historical to the interpersonal, psychological, aesthetic, and theological. Han and Humphrey. Humphrey is dissolving Han, are often addressed in literature and literary arts, such as prose, fiction, film, mask, dance, drama, and opera. Han and Humphrey have bound actors and audiences together, especially in pansori. Pansori is a Korean traditional musical drama, and in mask dances. In music, pansori is an exemplary genre because of the tales of sorrow and woe that are often related to Han. It is the vocal genre performed by a solo singer and accompanied by a percussionist on a barrel-shaped drum called book. The singer recounts a long dramatic narrative through song, in Korean sori, speech, Korean aniri, and gesture, Korean palling. Holding a fan and handkerchief while the drummer plays the book and makes calls for encouragement, which is called in Korean 추임새. The audiences play a significant part by calling out a word of encouragement as well. In pansori, text, mode, rhythms, in combination with timbre, contributes to the totality of the sound quality that express the underlying sorrow in which tears and ultimately Han is expressed. The narratives of pansori are a reflection of the pains and sorrows of common people. In situation where the text expresses a particularly painful experience, the dramatic vocal quality changes to portray emotions, and the normally harsh timbre becomes even more accentuated. This happens specifically at the end of climatic phrases that culminates in relatively high pitches. It is in this moment that the performer's voice often breaks with increased vibrato, imitating crying, as if a type of ritualized lamentation is taking place. There is particular rhythms pattern, which is called 장단, used for the theme of this text that is related to Han. As Willoughby narrates, 진양, the slowest 장단, which is 6/4 time signature, and 중머리, moderate, 12/4 time signature, are most often used in pansori during lyrical and sad situation. 중중머리 is moderative, fast, 12/8 rhythm, which is used to describe struggles and lamentation. In traditional Korean music, particularly in pansori, the rhythm patterns are associated with certain melodic modes. To emphasize emotional implication, mood, character, or set of action corresponding to a given sound quality. It is the 계면조 mode that is commonly used to express melancholy and lament because it evokes soft and sad feelings in the listener. The performer is free to ad-lib gestures as inspired, using a fan or a handkerchief as props in pansori. In cases of lamentation, the performer might raise arms as if it's calling out plea to the heavens. During such moment, singers generally kneel or sit on the ground, and as they cry out in anguish, they often hit the ground. Another example of Han in Korean traditional musical form is the Korean national folk song 아리랑. It is rooted in deep historical experience and feelings of Koreans, touches the soul of the people, and expresses their grief. 아리랑 is a song of Han that communicates prosaic emotion for lost love or homesickness in the form of folk ballad, a work song dating from the mid to late Joseon period, 1392 to 1910. It is a Korean resistance anthem and a symbol of national identity, a vehicle of remembrance in the public culture, conveying resilience and resistance to the cultural violence of Japanese imperialism. During Japanese colonization, 1910 to 1945, the Korean language was prohibited in school and the voice of Koreans were silenced. The Japanese rulers prohibited the singing of arirang when it became a song of constantly resisted life under Japanese colonization. Koreans sang the song in secret to build solidarity, recognizing the communal power of the music. Although it emerged from colonial experience, it has been transformed into a traditional pop song in modern society, trying to communities together by articulating the suffering of war, most recently in post-COVID-19. 아리랑 is generally composed of a gentle and lyrical melody, accompanied by the refrain 아리랑, 아리랑, 아라리요. Over an 아리랑 hill you go. It exists in multiple and traditional forms that vary accordingly to the lyrics and melody used in different regions. There are 36 known versions of 아리랑, which themselves has also gone through continuous development. The Ariran songs have articulated various themes. For example, the sorrow of lovers parting, the injustice of life for common people, the nostalgia for one's hometown, the disorientation experienced during period of dramatic change. They are songs of voicing endurance and resistance and hope for the dissolving of Han. Although every version has differences in tale, dialect, local sensibility, and rhythmic sense, there are one common element to all Ariran songs, the unchanging refrain. The lyrics and melodic embellishment can be freely improvised in a call and response structure. As a working song in Ariran, an appointed laborer would take the musical lead while fellow workers would respond, individually or collectively, with additional lyrics. The workers in a group would each bring their voices to the collective conversation in the lyrics, followed by a fixed refrain. It is said that Ariran began to circulate in a recognizable from among rural laborers from northern Gyeonggi-do province when the government had stolen their fields and exploited their labor to rebuild the Gyeongbok Royal Palace in Seoul in 1868. In this context, Ariran as a work song gives voice, expresses resistance, and builds community toward transformation. Korean traditional music can be communicated the experience of Han through text, traditional music elements, and vocal quality, and gestures that enable emotional release of long-held feelings of sadness, grief, or confusion. It can be employed in worship to express Han through Psalm of Lament by giving voice to muted suffering and build community toward liberation and salvation through the lament act itself. In terms of expressing Han in Korean sacred music, Psalms of Lament are an exemplary genre because they utilize poems and sorrows and suffering with traditional music elements. To illustrate, I show how Han is manifested in a lament psalm of Jehun Bak, in which pain, suffering, and resentment are demonstrated both musically and lyrically. The so-called father of Korean church, a minister and a composer, Jeun Bak wrote As the Deer in 1970, which was published in the Psalm Anthems choral book in 1973. It was a challenging time for him because he was considered a part of anti-governmental movement, and he and his family had to flee to America. In this setting of Psalm 42, he conveys complex feelings of lament as well as a confession of trust that he relies entirely on God for his life. Unlike many typical lament psalms, Psalm 42 features a series of complaints mixed with expression of trust. This tension-filled quality is part of its theological and spiritual character, for it is from first to last a prayer growing from a deep yearning for God. This is a psalm of searching and lamenting, opening the image of thirsty and distressed deer longing for life-giving water. God is true object of this continual restless mourning, and thirst is a central metaphor of this psalm. At the heart of this desire is the theological question, where is your God? There is in this psalm an uneasy contrast. We might even say an emotional oscillation between despair and hope. Bach's Psalm as the Deer is a musical expression of peaceful but fervent spiritual yearning. Bach expresses Han not only through the words but also the Korean traditional music elements in this anthem. The melisma, syncopated rhythm, for example, measure 12, 14, and etc. Modified dodori jangdan in the piano accompaniment, and the color and response style that is used in Korean folk song. In this opening of this Psalm of Lament, he uses melisma for the word painting on lungs to express longing and God to reveal the true object of yearning. In the second phrase, the melody rises with a crescendo toward the second lungs to accentuate the depth of the desire for God. The dramatic vocal qualities intensify and timbre becomes more accentuated in the climax, where the text asks plaintively, I seek for God. Where are you? This is particularly true at the end of the climax in measure 66 that culminates with relatively high pitches. In this moment, the performers sing with increased use of vibrato, metaphorically representing a cry out in pain. Syncopated rhythms in dodori jangdan are employed to show grave and strong feelings. This psalm utilizes the Korean form of color and response, embodying how Korean people sing folk songs to express their common situation. In this light, worship music can be a vehicle for both lament and community building, transformation during times of hardship like the pandemic. In this vein, to name and express my own suffering and hardship as an immigrant woman in these difficult and challenging times of isolation, I wrote a psalm of lament, Your Unfailing Love, that contains features of lament we have been discussing. The language of the text is a combination of original and contemporary setting, staying close to the psalmist's language of lament. Even though jarring and intense, it witnesses to an experience close to pain. Honesty about God's missing voice makes this psalm of lament a sanctuary for the voices of pain. It is based on Psalm 44 and 130, which spoke to my situation of great distress. The first two verses reference chapter 44, verse 9 to 26, which convey the psalmist's perception of Israel's crisis with a sense of disappointment and trust in tension. The psalmist's intense anguish is expressed through jarring language that is not often heard in church worship, but speaks as well of deep hope, juxtaposed with anguish as if to honor the character of each without nullifying the integrity of either. I chose to keep the language of feelings, God's rejection, God's face hidden, God's being asleep, etc., which can be unsettling because it testifies with honesty to feeling of anguish and despair and expresses frustration in light of a very real sense of God's absence. The last verse is based on Psalm 130, where the psalmist discovers God waiting for the prayer of people, trusting God as he calls upon Israel to put their hope in Yahweh. Although the words are coarse, the melody is deliberately lyrical and peaceful throughout the Psalm of Lament to convey the longing for spiritual transformation. To bring music and word together, I use word painting, relative minor on down to portray the dark feeling. The lowest note on ground, where the flute has the descending line, and the rising tonic triads on rise up and help. Word painting is a musical composition technique in which the tones, tempos, and dynamics of notes reflect the subject matter of a given song. The process of composing music with word painting typically involves writing notes that correspond to the feeling that a certain word evokes in listeners. Lyrics describing darkness and death are usually set to low tones and even dissonant notes. Certain phrases can be also written with long and even notes or with short, rapid notes depending on the word's meaning and connotations. So, as a conclusion, Psalms of Lament help people face suffering by appealing to God with sorrow, struggle, and pain that individuals, communities, and nations deal with, and opening up possibilities for resilience in the face of life's challenges and broken relationships. They invite us to honor and give voice to the muted pain in our hearts, which is disregarded in our society and in other parts of the world. Lament expresses in Korean musical forms which communicate the experience of Han. Pansori and Arirang shows how music intensifies this experience of suffering by singing together. The complexity of human experience of pain is reflected in Psalms of Lament in worship. The Korean Psalm of Lament as the dear and your unfailing love demonstrate the complex relationship between complaint and trust in the midst of struggle and hardship as the singers yearn for spiritual transformation. Through lamenting, Han can be transformed and provide new possibilities of resistance and resilience, its transcendent quality bringing the people into the very presence of God. Lament opens up possibilities for moving through the suffering, enabling transition from individual pain through communication to transformation, eventually affirming hope, issuing praises. Therefore, Psalms of Lament need to be intentionally revived today, especially in time of post-pandemic, as it enables us to become more open with God, with ourselves, and with each other as our relationships are strengthened and grow. Thank you.